to introduce our first presenter.
Good morning, everybody. As Andrea mentioned, my name is Haley, and I serve as the Development Director for ROSE. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker of the day, Ms. Harriet Washington. She is a prolific science writer, editor, and ethicist who is the author of Seminal Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Experimentation from Colonial Times to the Present, which won a National Book Critics Circle Award, along with other prestigious awards, and has authored 5 other well-known books. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Washington.
Hello, I am so pleased to be here and share with you some information and insights about the history and the generation of mythology about African Americans that separates us even today from equitable healthcare. Please bear with me for a moment. I have some slides I want to show you. In Medical Apartheid, it's primarily a book of history and ethics. I wrote it because I discovered after years of study and years of traveling, not only the United States, but also Europe, to talk about the history of medicine, that the history of African Americans has been systemically elided from the canon. We're simply not there. We're only there in a few stereotyped instances that serve to reinforce beliefs and mythologies about the behavior and the health of African Americans. So the book was written primarily as a corrective. And I know now that it's got a different rule. We are facing healthcare challenges today, which echo very closely the things that we faced in the 19th century. But few people know this because they don't know the history of the abuse of African Americans in the medical system. So I'm going to show you a slides, and I'm going to skip over a few of them. But if I skip over a slide that you want to know more about, just raise it during the Q&A. And to that end, if someone would be kind enough to let me know when I've got 5 minutes left before the Q&A should start, so I'll know to wind up and not natter on endlessly. I really want us to have a chance to discuss your questions. But looking at the history of medicine, some really important things when it comes to African Americans are salient, but they're completely ignored by the canon. Number one, when we talk about ethics, medical ethics, bioethics, discussions often start at Nuremberg. At that point, the United States was achieved moral superiority. It was U.S. prosecutors and U.S. doctors who confronted the Nazi architects of the Holocaust. They accused them, rightly so, of conspiring to murder Jews, Gypsies, Poles, other ethnic groups, including Afro-Germans. There are a number of Black people living in Germany during that time, and as there still are. But all the focus was on this moral statue of Americans, condemning the Nazis. But we have ignored our own past. In fact, we ignored what was happening during the late 1940s as the U.S. prosecutors and doctors were accusing the Nazi doctors. The Nazi defense was interesting. Karl Brandt argued that you Americans are accusing us of forcing people into experimentation, doing deadly experiments on them, doing racial experiments on them, singling out races for removal and for genocide. All of that was true, but he said the United States has done the exact same thing. He pointed out the abuse of African Americans, he pointed out the abuse of prisoners, and unfortunately he was right. This country has done the same thing, but we have done it since the 19th century. And even when Nuremberg was being conducted with the US pointing an accusing finger, some of the same doctors accusing the Germans were involved in deadly studies in which African Americans were, for example, injected with plutonium, a fiendishly dangerous element without their knowledge. So the same doctors accusing the Nazis were abusing African Americans. And this sort of ignorance is what I'm trying to counter here. And we're not only talking about the past. one of the things that has happened is that the things that were abuses in the past that seem so egregious and so strange and so horrendous are actually still taking place today in a more subtle form and often veiled semantically with words to make it look as if it's therapeutic research when really it's exploitation of African American bodies. A lot of the mythologies about African Americans have been cloaked in numbers by preeminent scientists. For example, the long-standing, very stubborn belief that African Americans are less intelligent than whites. It's ridiculous, but we still believe it. And we still have hereditarian scientists who are very happy to write books cloaked with a lot of numbers to intimidate people, to explain exactly why genetics dictates the inferiority of African Americans. They're wrong, but the mountains of data intimidate and confuse people. And that brings us to a really important point about science and history. These are two disciplines that we tend to look on, all of us, as being unimpugnable. That means that we think that if something is a scientific fact, you can't argue with it. It's scientific fact. You can't discuss that. You can't counter that. The same thing with history. The history written in books is taken as gospel. But as African Americans, we know better. The truth is, both science and history are conducted by people. And these people bring their biases and their beliefs and their mythologies to bear. They also tend to adopt historical dialogue and ethical frameworks and scientific research, which is engineered to support their mythologies. So you have science serving bias, including political bias, racial bias, not the other way around. So while we're revering science and history as things that are absolutely true, we're forgetting the fact that these are being conducted by people who have an agenda. Winston Churchill said it. History is written by the victims. And there's a Nazi proverb that says the same thing. Don't let the lion tell the giraffe story. When you have the victor, when you have the colonialist, when you have the imperialist telling the story of the people they abused, you are not going to get facts. You are not going to get accurate history, and you're not going to get logical, well-conducted science either. So in one sense, African Americans, Black people, people of color, Africans themselves, and both men and women, in US science, they have actually been invented by mythology. Technology has been used, but only in service to mythology. The mythology came first, and then came the character of African Americans as science revealed it. And that underlies something really, really important about race. Dorothy Roberts probably said it the best, I think, in her book, Fatal Invention. She points out that actually racism came first, and it invented race. I studied medieval literature. I studied Roman and Greek science, and there were no white people during those times. There were no Black people during those times. Black people were invented as a result of economic pressures and incentives around the same time that animal breeding, the science of animal breeding became important to the economy. The breeding and abuse and the use and appropriation of the bodies of enslaved people was also important. And they were characterized by science very similar manner to animals. And that was a very helpful thing when you characterize African Americans as not being wholly human, as the 19th century scientists did. They said, we're not talking about people belong to Homo species. It's a lower species. It's not really human beings. African Americans represent an intermediary between animals and human beings. And that supported the enslavement system, because now you have a class of beings who are not fully human. You don't have to treat them as fully human. You don't have to worry about their pain. You don't have to worry about their anxiety. In fact, scientists began to explain away all the arguments against enslavement. They said African Americans don't feel pain. They don't feel anxiety. They don't suffer from diseases that white people have. And so these mythologies were very important to science, but they were also very important to economics in this country, and very important to the the predominant view of white supremacy, of white people as being supreme somehow. Instead of admitting that white people were invented, instead of admitting that African Americans and Black people were also invented categories, These scientists cast it as a natural occurrence dictated by nature, which is not the case. So they invented race. And they invented race in their image to support their agenda, which was the enslavement and use of African American. One of the things I hear frequently from people is they'll say, well, you say that you found all this information and that it was secret information buried in old medical journals and old doctors' writings from the 18th and 19th century, but it's not really secret, is it? Anybody could have read those books, so it's not really secret. But I said, you don't understand what a secret is. A secret, as Marcel Pagnol said, it's not something unrevealed, it's something told privately in a whisper. And that's exactly what has happened here. For most of US medicine, white male doctors were speaking only to themselves. And at the beginning, they were not circumspect at all. They were very frank about what they were doing. They were very open about it. And even later on, when they became criticized and they began hiding their agendas, the communication was privileged only among them. One really important point I want to make before I go any further is that we hear a great deal about the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Frankly, it is trotted out whenever the healthcare system wants to explain the failure of African Americans to engage with the system. So they'll say that, oh, Black people are afraid of medical research, they're afraid of medical care because of Tuskegee. That's absolutely not true. There are 15 chapters in my book. Only one of them deals in part with Tuskegee. What African Americans are wary about and distrustful about is 4 centuries of abuse in the medical arena, consistent abuse. It's a logical reaction. It's tragic when it separates you from healthcare, but it's still logical. It only makes sense. So invoking Tuskegee is like it's a vague form of blame the victim. You know, you're blaming African Americans for behavior that separates them from healthcare without acknowledging that the healthcare system itself is profoundly flawed, profoundly inequitable, profoundly abusive toward African Americans. And then the hand-wringing about how can we make African Americans engage with the system and put their fears aside? The answer is really simple, but it's not easy. The answer is if you create a trustworthy healthcare system, people will flock to it. You will not have to encourage people to go to it. And but that's a difficult answer. It takes time and investment and thought. I think too often when we hear that question, how to make African Americans engage with the system, it's from people who are looking for a quick fix. They want something they can do now so they can conduct their research study. And that is not going to get us where we need to go. So I want to briefly talk about this system in the 19th century that I've been talking about. It's very influential even today. The best scientists in this country belong to this group of doctors who told Americans and told the world who African Americans were. As I alluded to earlier, they said African Americans had lower intelligence, bestial sexuality, that African Americans had diseases that white people didn't get. And they also had immunities to diseases that were very dangerous for white people. African Americans, for example, as I mentioned before, didn't feel anxiety, didn't feel pain. Why? These doctors told the world that African Americans had a nervous system that was very primitive, closer to animal nervous systems, and it was too primitive to register pain, anxiety, even things like heart disease, which back then were ascribed to anxiety. So African Americans, again, were a different species that had profoundly flawed inferior bodies, yet their bodies were very strong. This made them perfect for enslavement. It also made them perfect for medical research in the view of these doctors because you could operate on their body without any guilt. They wouldn't feel any pain. But it's actually illogical. If African Americans were so profoundly different from whites as they claimed, then why did they think they could do research on Black people that could actually translate to everyone? So there's a lot of illogic in this, but the belief was too profitable to dispense with. It was too profitable to say that African American bodies could be not only medically but also ethically used in a way that you would never use white bodies. Black people were blamed for their own illnesses, either their flawed bodies or their failure to their lack of adult judgment, their lack of intelligence. A lot of illnesses were ascribed to that. was also believed that African Americans had a bestial sexuality that was more like rutting animals than human beings. This was used to excuse a great many abuses. Among women, was used to excuse the rape of Black women. They were characterized by doctors as well as by landowners of the time as being sexually profligate, who would have sex with anyone. They were even described as being aggressively sexual toward their white masters. Completely absurd. And yet it served the society's needs at the time. For men, it was just as bad. A doctor named Fred Lidston wrote that African American men were not only bestial and aggressive in their sexuality, but they preferred white women, which made them dangerous because it was well known that all African Americans had sexually transmitted diseases. It sounds so ridiculous, but actually it was a commonplace for the time. All doctors believed that African Americans all had sexually transmitted diseases. And frankly, if you look at data today, there are questions. I think it's true that prevalence of certain illnesses is actually higher among African Americans, infectious illnesses of all kinds, not just sexual ones. But it's also true that data collection tends to distort it. Data collection for African American tends to be involuntary and take place in public settings. White people are more likely to have access to a private physician, private care, where there may not be reporting of their STDs. And so we end up with a data picture of African Americans as being having very high rates of STDs, which I think are inflated. I'm not saying the rates are not relatively high, they may be, but they certainly are inflated. So paired with the belief that African Americans didn't feel any pain, what did doctors do when an African American said they were in great pain, say in too much pain to work? Well, they accused them of malingering. We know that you people don't feel pain. So obviously, if you're claiming to feel pain, you're lying. You're lying because you're lazy, or you're lying to get out of work. Again, we see this today, the same behavior today in the healthcare system. In 2016, the University of Virginia did the latest of many studies showing that 50% of medical students believe that African Americans did not feel pain the way whites do. So did many practicing doctors. They also believed that African American bodies were different than whites. They believed that African Americans needed more radiation than whites for the same conditions. These are right out of the 19th century, and yet contemporary studies consistently show that the healthcare system still embraces the belief. And what happens when Black people present at hospitals in great pain, for example, suffering from sickle cell crises, which are profoundly painful? They're rejected. They're sent away as drug seeking. Their claims of pain are not believed, and they're stereotyped as seeking drugs, the exact same treatment they got in the 19th century during enslavement. So we have not managed to escape a lot of these biases. They were useful for white supremacy then, and unfortunately, in some areas, they're useful today. And even if they weren't, the fact is they have become habits of thought. They become mythologies that are integrated in medical practice. We read every day about evidence-based medicine and peer-reviewed studies, but the reality is many of these studies are profoundly flawed because they unquestioningly adopt the mythology that has been prevalent for centuries about Black pain, about Black illnesses, about diseases that Blacks do and do not get. And it can be not only devastating for the health of African Americans, it can actually endanger their lives. People suffering from sickle cell disease, I have been really appalled to talk to my physician friends and learn that many of them stereotype them as drug seeking. I was frankly shocked to find out how prevalent that was. And the New York Times ran an article maybe a month or so ago that really was arresting. It said that African Americans who were killed by the police might not actually have been killed by the police. Perhaps they had sickle cell trait and oxygen deprivation, say from being in a chokehold, caused their death. I found that completely shocking. An exculpatory, dialogue like that exonerates the police for abusing Black people and blames their own defective bodies. Aside from the fact that it was scientifically erroneous, which is kind of strange because the New York Times has a lot of scientists, a lot of physicians and nurses on their staff as reporters. They certainly should know better. And how they could confuse sickle cell trait with sickle cell disease. If you read the article, you'll see that they were careful to note the difference. But when they're discussing the behavior and the reactions, they are not differentiating between trait and disease. So this kind of thing has still not ended. This mythology is still prevalent, even in what we call the paper of record, even in the highest spheres of medicine. And that's another important point I think I need to make, which is that these doctors in the 19th century were the best doctors in the country. They were very influential because they were at the best institutions. They were publishing. Medicine was very different then. Publishing was not as important as it is now. But they were high status physicians. And a lot of the biases and the components of white supremacy in healthcare today still eminent from the best institutions. And that's deeply troubling. What are some of the diseases that Black people had that white people didn't have? Well, a lot of them were imaginary. They were made up. They didn't really exist. Disease Ethiopica, Hebitude. These are these diseases that were characterized by refusing to work, talking back to a white man, and horror of horrors, slapping a white man, hitting a white man. And then there was drapetomania, that disease ascribed to Black slaves who ran away. If you were enslaved in ancient Greece or Rome, it was natural to run away if you could. But when African Americans ran away from enslavement, they were slapped with a diagnosis with a strong forensic component. Essentially, medicine treated them as if they had stolen themselves and said that they must be mentally ill because why else would they leave the paradise of the plantation where their every need was met? Completely absurd, right? And yet, this mentality really shows the white gaze that still is predominant when looking at disease and disease behavior in African Americans. Also, some diseases affected everyone, but they were ascribed only to Black people. And two examples of those were pellagra, nutritional deficiency disease. Slaves suffered from it because they were being starved. And they were getting a diet that was devoid of many nutrients. And yet it was called a racial disease, and it was ascribed to their dirt and their behavior. So they were blamed for having pellagra. Only later, after enslavement, when poverty escalated among poor whites in the South, was it studies done that demonstrated that it was not a racial disease, but one that would affect anybody so poor that they couldn't afford a decent diet. Joseph Goldberger found this in 1910, but it took the U.S. 1920. It took the U.S. 20 years to accept it. For 20 years, doctors persisted in seeing pellagra as a racial disease when they knew that it was not. And of course, pain, as I mentioned, pain was very, very important. It's very important today. But all these other illnesses are things that Blacks are said to be immune to. They didn't die from yellow fever. They didn't die from malaria. At the same time, of course, doctors' journals were filled of accounts of treating Blacks who had malaria and yellow fever. They knew this wasn't true, but the belief, the theory was too valuable to white supremacy to give it up. So although they knew it wasn't true, they still would voice it in making their case that African Americans were poor and needed to be enslaved for their own good because they couldn't care for themselves. For syphilis, the belief that Blacks had a neurological, naivete, a nervous system that was really undeveloped, took an interesting turn. 19th century doctors declared that syphilis would affect the muscles of Black people, but would never go to the brain in the tertiary stage. It would never cause paresis, a horrible mental disorder that would eventually kill people in the last stage of syphilis. They said that didn't affect Black people, only the muscle problems. And an interesting claim, because when the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was conducted, that was their most consistent sought after goal. They were trying to prove that Black people did not have any neurological symptoms of syphilis, only only methyl symptoms. And they actually wrote that up as one of the papers of the study. Now, the paper was looked at by the AMA panel and said, it's rubbish. It doesn't prove this at all. But what I find important about it is you had doctors in 1972 trying to prove a theory from the 19th century. You know, an illustration of how much we are still in thrall, or white supremacy is still in thrall, the 19th century beliefs. Today, we still have diseases that we think of as Black diseases, and they're not. Sickle cell disease is probably the best known one. But crack babies, what's interesting is that now that we understand that the crack baby was wholly an invention meant to demonize Black mothers, you know, destroying your baby's brains because you can't resist crack. It's absurd. An article in Teratology, the journal, analyzed papers claiming that crack babies were a phenomenon and found that they were very poor quality, and that their papers that had questioned the existence of crack baby were often not published, even though they were better, more logical papers and better designed. They simply did not fit in with the political narrative that was predominant at the time. I was a newspaper editor, and when they talk about crack babies now, I see that sometimes they use illustrations of white babies. But I was a newspaper editor, and during the 8 years I was a newspaper editor, I never saw a published photo of a white crack baby. Crack babies were by definition Black. Here are a few statements about doctors illustrating their belief that African Americans did not feel pain. They're not true, of course, but they were published in medical journals, and other doctors believed them and practiced accordingly. Here's a 2016 paper I alluded to, showing that the belief that Black people don't feel pain is alive and well in 21st century medicine. Hispanic as well. And this gentleman is James Marion Sims. He's the epitome of the white doctor who was revered by the medical system and revered by the populace as a benefactor. He's called the father of American gynecology. Inscription on his various statues across the world and across the country praise him, saying he treated empress and slave alike. They make him sound like a real mensch, like a wonderful person who was humanitarian, who cared about women's issues. And I read this so frequently. When I studied medical ethics at Harvard Medical School, I read so frequently about his beneficence. I thought to myself, when I write medical apartheid, I'm going to make sure I write about this fellow, because I want people to know that not all these doctors were bad. Not all of them were racist. But when I read Dr. Sims' own work, I realized he was the worst of the worst. I mean, he actually obtained Black women. He rented them, borrowed them, locked them in a shack on his property, and then over the course of at least 5 years, repeatedly did surgery on their genitalia without anesthesia in an attempt to correct vesicovaginal fistula, a horrible complication of prolonged childbirth. Now, childbirth complications, as you all know better than I, were rampant during the 19th century. And there was relatively little that white doctors could apply to deal with them. Interestingly, many women, including white women in the South, preferred Black women. They preferred Black midwives and healers because Black midwives used techniques that white doctors didn't use. They would use tea, they would use psychological and social support. They simply rendered care that was centered more upon the woman's holistic well-being and the baby's holistic well-being. They actually had technical superiority over white doctors, although it's not usually described that way. The fact is that in Africa and in China, a lot of midwifery used techniques that preserve cleanliness, was thought to be very important. They would use rags to collect the baby and bodily parts, but they made sure to boil the rags, made them scrupulously clean. White doctors operated in their dirty street clothes and didn't clean their instruments between patients. And therefore, white doctors had higher mortality rates, higher rates of complications like vesicovaginal fistula. When specula were introduced and when forceps were introduced, the rate of vesicovaginal fistula escalated. But Black midwives didn't use these. So there was a lot of competition with a lot of white doctors being very angry about the fact that so many women, including white women, preferred the black women, and they would castigate them as being, oh, unchristian, African, doing all kinds of who knows what kind of voodoo on women. But the reality was they had better outcomes, and which was comical in some cases. One doctor, Dr. Whitfield, actually wrote, well, it's true that they're successful, but um, only because they're a lucky negress, as he put it. He said he ascribed it to luck, but it wasn't luck. It was a superior skill. Now, Dr. Sims decided to learn how to close these fistulae in women, and he experimented on these women, again, without their permission, without anesthesia, very painful, very distressingly intimate procedure. One enslaved woman, Anarcha, had 30 surgeries over 5 years. And finally, he learned how to close them. Immediately, he left. He went to Paris and where he became the doctor of Empress Eugenie, rumored to have vesicovaginal fistula. Then he came to New York City at the New York Academy of Medicine, where I'm now a fellow. This statue is right across from the Academy of Medicine. And while at the Academy, he was revered, very powerful, was elected to become the head of the American Medical Association. And yet, the mythology that it was beneficent surgery is promulgated even today. There are a lot of doctors and historians have said to me, well, Sims said he got women's permission. I don't believe that. He said that only after people, his contemporaries, accused him of not getting their permission. But even if he had gotten their permission, it meant nothing. An enslaved woman, like an enslaved man, suffered severe penalties for not doing the will of her master. You could be executed for saying no, or refusing to work, or refusing to do what was said. So asking an enslaved woman her permission is meaningless. The inherently coercive nature of enslavement negates the possibility of offering consent. So they could not consent. And yet this is still used today as an excuse for his activity, saying they agreed to it. They did not agree to it. And so there's still a rousing debate. Many people, including surgeons, defending James Marion Sims. I think he's indefensible, but he's also a perfect example of the dual face of American medicine, where one face is turned to whites of benevolence, another face turned to Black people of exploitation. I'm happy to say that Dr. Sims' statue is no longer across from the Academy of Medicine in Central Park. I was there. I gave a talk at the Academy of Medicine. And when I talked about him, a woman in the audience jumped up and said, we ought to tear that statue down. Well, it took the women in the area, who are now mostly Black and Hispanic, it took them 10 years of fighting with Central Park Conservancy, City Hall, advocating, activism, but they were finally successful. And Mayor de Blasio dictated the statue should be taken down from Central Park and banished to a cemetery in Brooklyn. So it was taken down. I was there. I was really happy about this. And let's see, I've got a little clip here. I hope that you'll be able to hear it. So Dr. Sims is now gone. But the question posed by his statue still remains. His statues are still up elsewhere, and more to the point, it tells us something, I think, about our medical heroes. How do we determine who's a medical hero? In this country, we tend to determine it based on what they've achieved, or what we think they've achieved. We don't ask how they did it, and that's a profound problem. It goes far beyond Dr. James Marion Sims. Even today, achieving a medical milestone or innovation or development is considered far more important than protecting the dignity and the rights of the subjects you predicate it on. And that's very different. I was struck with the difference between here and Germany. I spent some years in Germany as a child. I go back periodically to visit friends. And one of the things I've noticed is you don't see any statues of Hitler or Goebbels. You know, instead you see things like these little Stolperstein or little brass plaques. They're in front of the houses of people who were taken away during the Holocaust. Say you're taken away to Theresienstadt and never seen again, or Auschwitz. There's a little plaque in front of the house telling who you were, date you were taken away. Basically, despite their ugly, ugly 30-year history in Germany, they have learned to commemorate the victims. Where in this country, we still are, for some reason, commemorating the villains, Confederate generals, medical monsters, and it has to do with our misplacing praise on medical innovators rather than asking how the innovation was done. Whoops. So eventually, medicine left the plantation for clinics and hospitals. And in clinics and hospitals, Black bodies were appropriated widely. In 1995, Medical College of Georgia was renovating its old anatomy laboratory. They found 9,800 human bones. 75% of them came from African Americans. And this is a scene that's been repeated across the country. No caches that large have been found, but all around the country, universities and medical schools have found caches of Black bodies taken anatomical dissection. During this time, Victorian era, nobody wanted their body used for medical dissection. It was considered shameful, and many people found it to be a spiritually and religious dangerous act. They feared that someone whose body had been dissected could not be could not be resurrected. And for Black people, it represented an extension of enslavement into eternity in that sense. So nobody at that time wanted this. And that's why laws were enacted and policies were applied where only Black bodies were used by many schools. W. Montague Cobb, the first African American professor of physiology, he wrote a paper showing that in Cleveland, Black cadavers were used before the migration. When there were very few Black people in Cleveland, they still made up the bodies on the anatomy table. This is because at Northern medical schools, including Harvard, including a lot of, in fact, most Northern medical schools, had contracts with Southern schools to send them a certain number of Black bodies every year. The bodies were usually shipped by train. And that let them use Black bodies in anatomy without the white community, being afraid that, their own bodies would be used. African American practitioners did not escape racism. In fact, it fell very heavily upon them. Of course, this involved nurses and other healthcare workers as well. But I did a lot of research focused on physicians, and a group of us wrote a paper for JAMA that was published in July 2008. And we detailed how Black physicians and their white sympathizers were using the same civil rights tactics, for example, that other people used. Sitting at Woolworth's lunch counters, for example, forcibly integrating restaurants, going on marches. Black doctors did the same thing because they were being excluded not only from medical training, but from board certification, from training and research, from the AMA. In many cases, they were being barred from the kind of training they needed to be effective doctors. The Flexner Report, which is celebrated by white America as a big step in professionalism, in establishing medicine as a professional entity, but it did so on the backs of African American doctors. The substandard hospitals were closed by the Flexner Report, but all Black hospitals and medical schools were closed except for two, Howard and Meharry, that Abraham Flexner deemed worthy of support. And even then, he said, even so, Black doctors should never be allowed to practice independently. Only under white doctors, never on white people. They should be barred from specialization. He said Black doctors should only be sanitarians, under the watchful eye of whites. A very damning document that is often presented to students as some kind of achievement. It actually was not an achievement for African American doctors. In fact, if you look at Black male doctors in particular, their numbers are very low. And the last estimate I read said the peak for African American male doctors was 1987. So even though African Americans are being increasingly represented in medical school, the fact is that Black doctors are not enjoying that progress. A lot of factors are conspiring against them. And that's the paper. It was in JAMA, I believe July 8th, 2008. So one thing that has been almost completely overlooked by the healthcare system is how much African Americans have contributed to American medicine. It is staggering. And these are only a smattering of the doctors. I didn't include here nurses. I didn't include here, birth workers and other people did important work. But just looking at this few examples, certain diseases, for example, completely owe their treatment to African Americans. If you look at smallpox, enslaved Onesimus taught Cotton Mather how to do the first variolation, a precursor, of course, of inoculation. So vaccines, we owe our knowledge of vaccines to an enslaved African. Cotton Mather was given the credit. Zabdiel Boylston, who actually put it in practice in Boylston, was given the credit, and Onesimus was basically ignored. We know who he is, but he's not credited and lionized the way he should be. And then subsequently, Lewis T. Wright revolutionized technique during World War II. Hinton wrote a landmark book on syphilis. So we know some conditions we actually only know about and have only been characterized through the work of African Americans. Solomon Carter Fuller, the gentleman in the first one in the second row. Interesting story. I have a friend who's a resident or was a resident in neurology in Munich, and I was visiting Munich. I was walking down the hospital with him, and I saw a dark-skinned fellow in like one of the portraits on the wall. I was like, "Who is this guy?" I found out he had worked with Alzheimer to characterize Alzheimer's disease early on. And when he came back to the U.S., he was in Boston. He worked as a psychiatrist, but he also did research into Alzheimer's. So we have not actually given Black doctors and researchers their due. They've been much more influential than has been acknowledged, and that is really hobbling a lot of our discussions about African Americans in medicine. A lot of the more cynical, racist discussions center upon, are they going to be as competent as white doctors? Is this affirmative action going to allow too many substandard practitioners? When the reality is, many of them, in fact, if not all of them, we can't really know for sure, but many of them have achieved much higher things, have been much better than the run of white practitioners. Tissue appropriation has been very common. I already talked about the use of bodies for in total dissection. Bodies were actually used for display. Live patients were brought to hospitals not to treat them, but to show medical students what a hepatic abscess looked like, or show medical students how to remove an arm or a leg. And everyone now knows about Henrietta Lacks. I spoke to her husband in the 1990s, and he, stressed to me that he had never given permission to have her tissues taken, and yet they were taken. But she's not the only one. This was actually something that happened very commonly to people of color. I've written about how in 1969 and 70, 15,000 Black boys living in Baltimore had their genetic samples taken to try to prove a connection to genetic violence. And the same study was done in Boston and in LA and in New York City in the late 1990s. Young Black boys were involved in the same kind of study, looking for the quote-unquote mean gene, a gene that made people prone to violence. The focus has always been on African-American men in looking for genetic focus of violence. The Syphilis Study, in which 399 Black men who were diagnosed with syphilis were not treated but lied to. They were told they were being treated, but actually they're being maintained in their infectious state so doctors could monitor the progression of the disease. And why would doctors do that? Syphilis is an ancient disease. We know what it does, right? But no, these doctors did it because they wanted to demonstrate that in African Americans, syphilis did not affect the brain. It only affected the muscles. They kept the men sick and hired a nurse, Eunice Rivers, to make sure that they would appear for their appointments and also appear for their autopsies. So One doctor said, we have no more interest in these men until they die. They're like living corpses because the medical system only wanted their bodies in order to prove this completely absurd racist theory. But interestingly, a lot of the myths that surround medical abuses and malpractice are illuminating. We use the word myth, and for common colloquial use, you're talking about something that's not true, and you're also implying the person who believes it is not too smart. They're being kind of gullible. But for academics, mythology is a little bit different. A myth may be true or may be false, but it always tells you something very important about the person's culture and beliefs and values. And so some of the myths around Tuskegee are illuminating in that way. There's a myth about the men being Tuskegee Airmen. Let me start with another one. A myth about the men being injected with syphilis. Now, frankly, I would not have put it past the public health service to inject the men. If they had needed to inject the men in order to have, sources of sera and men who are infected, I think they would have done it because it had been done, as Susan Lederer has pointed out to us, at least 40 occasions. Researchers have done exactly that, given Americans an STD to do research on them. But they didn't. They didn't because they already had men who had been diagnosed with syphilis, and it's duly recorded. But very often people talk about the myth. They say, well, African Americans believe that men were injected, and that's just a myth. African Americans were not the source of that myth. One of the researchers in the study himself said this. You can find it in the congressional record. So it actually came from a researcher in the study. I have no idea why he made that claim. I don't think it was true. I think it's really important that it's used to illustrate African American gullibility, but it really illustrates something else. A lie told by a researcher for some reason. Also, there's a myth that Tuskegee Airmen were victims. Now, interestingly, I only heard this myth, relatively recently. I remember hearing it like in the late 80s and 90s, and I thought it's kind of strange. I don't really find it early on. Why do people think Tuskegee Airmen were the victims? Maybe it's just like a simple association. And I mentioned that to my husband. He said, no, it was HBO. Like, what do you mean? He said, HBO did a made-for-TV movie where they had Larry Fishburne as head of the Tuskegee Airmen. Then Larry Fishburne starred in the movie about Miss Evers' Boys, about the Tuskegee Study, and people would associate him. People confuse the two. It's possible. But again, the important thing is that these myths are things that should not really be ignored. They're used to castigate people as being credulous, but we ought to look on them as a chance to understand. Because to me, I think one of the real imports of this myth about Tuskegee Airmen is like an acknowledgement that Tuskegee University was a victim of the study too. If you knew anything about Tuskegee up to like the 50s and 60s, it was a black Mecca. It was a black Harvard. Black people were not allowed into many Ivy League schools, maybe any Ivy League schools. And so if you were scientifically inclined and very smart and an academic, you gravitated towards Tuskegee, where you could learn anything, veterinary science, physics, space science. I mean, Black people who were very smart and barred from other institutions would go to Tuskegee. All around the world, they flock there as a mecca of learning. But now you say Tuskegee, and what do people think about the study? It's a very sad, eventuality. So I'm going to go through very briefly some of the many, many types of experiments, radiation experiments in which this fellow and other people injected people, most of whom were Black, with high doses of radiation that killed them. They died painfully without getting their permission, and they gave them radiation for tumors that they knew did not respond to radiation. They knew the tumors were radio resistant. Even their white colleagues were saying, why are you doing this to these people? Well, here you've got Dr. Sanger explaining why. Dr. Lushbaugh, actually, his partner. And then prison experiments were so horrendous. There was an infinite variety of research and abuses. Prisoners were killed by infections, by very dangerous chemicals being inserted into them. I mean, there was such a constellation, each one more horrible than the other. And it happened over decades. But in the 1970s, it was so bad around the time the Tuskegee Study was stopped, um, a law was actually passed banning research in prisons. Only certain types of research can be conducted. Had to be research basically that would benefit prisoners, and that was that went on for a long time until 2005, when very quietly the Institute of Medicine panel voted to reopen prisons to research. I think that was a wrong step, and unfortunately, I expect us to be hearing horrible things again, because again, prisons are like enslavement. You can talk about getting consent, but can prisoners really consent? They can't consent freely. It's an inherently coercive environment. Very often, prison boards will openly predicate whether prisoners are released, paroled, given privileges based on whether they join in experiments. The possibility to make money in prison is very limited. Prisoners are paid criminally low wages, but they can make more money in experimentation. And for prisoners, money can be very important. It's not, not to buy a few baubles, but it can be the price of freedom. If you make enough for bond, for example, very few ways to make that kind of money in prison. So anyway, big mistake, but we're doing it anyway, and I'm just shuddering to think what's going to happen. And a panoply here now of white researchers. Every one of these researchers developed something we think was very important, but every one of them predicated on the savage abuse of African American bodies. So what do we do about all this? There are a lot of steps that I've recommended, and there's no time to go into all of them, but I do want to talk about one really important one, which has resurgent during coronavirus. Very often, the dialogue around Tuskegee has been used to explain why African Americans did not join in testing for the coronavirus vaccines, and now are refusing the vaccines. Both claims are wrong. I looked at the data for the Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech studies and found that in each study, about 10% of the subjects were African American. In this country, 12.3% of the people are African American, which means that African Americans had a very respectable showing. That was a great representation. There was no widespread. And yet, every single day last summer, I was reading headlines. Why are Black people avoiding the studies? They simply weren't. Again, we're looking at a mythology that is trumping the facts. And then now that now the dialogue had begun, African Americans are rejecting the vaccine. Some are. Some people of every race are rejecting the vaccine. In this country, vaccine skepticism is very high, but the focus is only on African Americans. Why? African Americans being 12.3% of the population. What about the 81% of the population? How many of them, how many whites? The white people are the ones driving the numbers here in terms of herd immunity. What percentage of them are rejecting the vaccine? There's not the same focus on them or other races. So again, this becomes a subtle form of blaming the victim. What's happening is that African Americans had less access to the vaccine. Even if you wanted it, was hard to get. If you worked at home and had the luxury of going through the lists online, the list of institutions offering the vaccine several times a day, after a few weeks, you might get an appointment. That's exactly how I got an appointment, but it took me weeks, and I had the luxury of checking whenever I wanted. Most African Americans don't have that luxury. Most of them cannot practice social distancing. They're working in jobs where they don't have access to the internet. They don't have the time. They don't have the access. They don't always have the internet access. So we had barriers put between them and the vaccine. There's also the barrier of age. We prioritize access to the elderly. And yes, that makes sense. The elderly were more vulnerable, and they should have had high access. But what does that do when you prioritize based only on age? Looking at people 85 years old and older, you're looking at white people. In this country, the number of Black people 90 and older is half the number of white people. Half the rate of white people. there are far fewer African Americans in this age group. So by prioritizing age, you're effectively excluding African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans. These are all very young populations. So we talk a lot about life expectancy and how it's lower in these groups, but here's an example of why it is a dramatic, something should have been taken into account in making policy. So also, I think it's really important to understand how easy it is for supposedly objective data, like census data, like algorithms used to determine medication and surgical applications. These data look objective, the columns of numbers, but very often when you look at how they're procured, you look at how they're analyzed, they are anything but. I talked to a scholar I very much admire, and she told me how she was at her doctor's and they're looking at osteoporosis data, trying to find out if she's at risk or not. And doc kept saying, I don't know what's going on, but I can't get an assessment. I can't get it to give me anything. And he said, let me try something. In the data he was asked to input, one of the things he was asked about was a race of the patient. He took her race out and bingo, got exactly the information that they needed. So very often these algorithms shroud some blatant racism in terms of predicting outcomes based on race that are not predictable based on race. They become self-fulfilling prophecy when you begin separating people from the treatment they need. So I think we need to keep that in mind too, and scrutinize our policies and make sure that we're not encouraging this. We also have to, it's also important for us to understand that trying to achieve healthcare equity means having written protocols based on this is what we need to see. This is what's equitable. For example, if you have patients presenting in pain, every patient should be evaluated. If you look at you ought to have a protocol saying that if you are looking at your data and you find that the African American patients are being disproportionately sent away as drug seeking, don't just accept that. We already have studies showing this is a result of bias. Scrutinize that. When you find that this is happening, there also need to be penalties. I mean, meaningful penalties. We often focus upon education and better training as a way to solve these inequities, but that's not going to do it. We need more. What we need are penalties that mean something. Institutions and practitioners who are not evaluating their patients appropriately, who are getting poor outcomes from patients of color, there need to be consequences for that. They should be made to explain that, and it should affect their ability to advance. Maybe you shouldn't be able to finish your residency program if there's evidence that you are treating patients of color differently. Maybe you shouldn't be able to receive federal funds if your hospital has a poor record of giving appropriate care to all ethnic groups. We need to institute penalties, something to make the rules meaningful, and to move it from the context of here's something nice we ought to do for Black people to this is a quality of care issue. If we're not giving appropriate and equitable quality of care, then we're not fulfilling our function, and we should not be paid or rewarded. We need to be penalized until we've ameliorated this. It needs to be taken seriously. It needs to be codified. It needs to be treated like a quality of care issue. There need to be penalties as well as rewards. I think that's probably one of the best things we can do in terms of improving healthcare. There are a few other things I wanted to talk about, but I do say I'm coming up on the time for Q&A. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discourse. So thank you so much for listening to me.
Washington, I have about 7 more minutes for your presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
Okay, great. Let me know when I should be quiet. Thank you. All right. So it's amazing we're still talking about this, but today the hereditarians are alive and well. These are scientists who believe that African Americans are less intelligent than whites because of genetics. James Watson is probably their poster boy. He was the man who's credited with finding the structure of DNA. He got a Nobel Prize for this in 1962, and he constantly shares his belief that African Americans are genetically less intelligent. Many scientists who share this belief have something else in common, political agenda. They are funded by the Pioneer Fund to a person. They also have they have political beliefs. Almost every one of these scientists has looked for, sought, or achieved legislative office. They've joined legislators, either state legislators or even Congress, in order to enact laws that would restrict immigration based on claims of low IQ, or to restrict African American women's fertility. Shockley is the first person I met who was espousing these views. He lived in the 1960s when I was a high school student, and I had the dubious honor of meeting him. And after he gave us a lecture to show us that African Americans were genetically less intelligent, he joined the California legislature where he introduced a law saying that all African American women should be sterilized to prevent an underclass of the low IQ children they would bring into the world. So these scientists, they are scientists, but they're something more. They also have a strong political agenda. They're also funded by the Pioneer Fund, which is openly devoted to, quote, the preservation of Western civilization. They're open racist. And yet when they write things like the bell curve, they are celebrated. They're treated with a lot of respect, which I don't think they deserve. I remember one of them, Philip Rushton, when he was at the University of Toronto, he actually went to the Eaton Mall in Toronto. I don't know if you've been there, an upscale shopping mall. He went to the shopping mall and conducted his research by asking passersby how far they could ejaculate, how large their penis was. This passed for quality research. It was shocking to me. But he was respected until the day he unfortunately passed away. So I think that we have to remember, for us as healthcare workers, it's really important not to be intimidated by these scientists and their, brandishing of weaponizing their genetic acuity, and understand that they have a very, very basic message, and they're often propping it up with poor science. And we need to be, I think, very open about challenging this, because if we don't, who else is going to? I point out in my book about environmental racism that if you look at hereditary claims, one of the things that they love to flog is that there's a 15-point IQ gap on average between Black and white Americans. You can't refute that. And to them, this is proof of the genetic propensity to low intelligence. And, the thing is, when people say to them, okay, given that there's this gap, we'll take your word for this, you can close it. Aren't there things that you can do? And they will always claim, no, it's genetic, you can't change it. Anybody who knows anything about genetics knows that's not true. Genetic conditions can indeed be improved. Phenylketonuria, as you know, are children who, if they have phenylalanine in their diet, will become mentally retarded. But if they're diagnosed early and it's withheld from their diet, they'll have normal intelligence. So yes, you can address these things, but it's to their benefit to embrace futility and say that nothing can be done about it. I always like to invoke what happened in 1924. In 1924, we had pockets of this country where people also had an IQs that were 15 points on average lower than the average IQ. And no one really knew what to do about that. At the same time, around the same time, we decided to add iodine to salt. It had nothing to do with IQ. We were worried about people developing goiters in their thyroid from iodine deficiency. By adding iodine to salt, which costs maybe $2 a ton, you just spray potassium iodide on the salt. By doing that, we thought we will reduce the incidence of goiters, and we did. Goiters almost disappeared. But at the same time, the IQ in those low IQ areas rose to the national average. What we didn't know was that iodide deficiency was contributing to mental retardation. It actually still is like the biggest cause of mental retardation, and we had unwittingly corrected that by adding iodide to salt very cheaply, very quickly, in a single generation. We got rid of these pockets of low IQ. So their arguments about futility hold no water. Globally, infection is very closely correlated to intelligence. The higher your disease burden, the more infectious disease you have. And the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. Among other things, infection challenges the ability of the fetus or young children whose metabolic budget is like 20, what? I think metabolic budget is maybe 25% devoted to building a brain. So most of their budget goes to building a better brain. But if you are building a brain, as a fetus or as a young child, and at the same time you're fighting off infectious disease, you can't do both. The brain suffers. There's derangement, structures that aren't formed properly, and you have brain problems that may not fully emerge until adolescence. So the burden of disease, infectious disease, is really important for intelligence, and yet we have tended to overlook that. And one of the final things I want to address is a very basic question I alluded to right at the beginning. I talked about race being invented. And people will say, is race real? Well, clearly race is real, but it's real, real sociological invention. It's something imposed on people. It's not something people are born with. And when you basically your healthcare reflects the race that you're perceived as belonging to. The kind of healthcare you get, the kind of environment you live in, the kind of assaults that you're going to face are predicated on race, because we relegate people of certain races to areas and to situations where they're going to have a much higher environmental assault, and that is going to play into their health care. But race is not real in that people are not born belonging to a race, and their health care is not a product of their race. Their health care is a product of how they're being treated. And yet, race has become the Human Genome Project. One of its big products was this knowledge that, okay, there's so little genetic variation between the races that race certainly can't be real. However, the other products belie that. A lot of work into quote unquote personalized medicine went into finding drugs and applications that putatively were held to be more effective among certain racial groups. A good example of that was Bidal. This drug was actually a combination of two unpatented modalities into a patented entity, and the patent holder arranged to have it tested, and FDA said no. There's no efficacy. We don't see any utility here. It's not helping people with congestive heart failure. Okay, well, they began data mining. Let's look for a group that it does work. And they looked in women and looked in other groups, nothing. But then they looked in African Americans, and they thought they saw a Philip that, maybe it's more powerful than African Americans. But they didn't go back to the FDA immediately and ask the FDA to. They went to African American groups. And they told them, listen, we have this new drug. It's going to be great for African Americans, and we need your support to get the FDA to allow more testing. They also gave these groups some money. They gave some of the African American groups they were medical groups money to test it. And they all wrote in support of Bidal testing. Bidal was tested, and the FDA approved it as the first drug to be approved in African Americans only in 2005. The testing was curious. Their claim was that Bidal works better in blacks than whites. So you would expect that they would be testing blacks and whites, but they didn't. They only tested people who self-identified as black. They claimed there was a genetic mechanism, but they didn't check the genetics of the people who were in the study. Anybody who claimed to be black and wanted to be in the study was permitted in the study. There were no white people, and yet they claimed it was superior to whites. They only did that by comparing it to the old rejected data from 1987. The FDA had already rejected as being too weak. So very poor science, but very good marketing. And so now we have a drug that is identified as a drug for Black people. The problem goes beyond the fact that it's not accurately marketed. It's not actually a good drug for Black people. it actually tends, the existence of the drug, the approval of this drug tends to exacerbate people's belief in biological race. It's often trotted out as an example of course, race exists. That drug works for Black people, doesn't work for white people. That's a big problem. Also, it can only be taken in conjunction with other drugs. So it's actually more expensive therapy than drugs that are given for white people. And then there's the fact that for white people, the drug is not FDA approved. So they may have difficulty getting it if it works for them. There are a lot of problems inherent in this, and it's a really good example of how sloppy our thinking is around race and how desperate we are to find a biological race, whether it exists or not.
Miss
These are,
Washington, we have about
yes.
2 minutes remaining for you. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. Fine. So these two books, very good books. I highly recommend both of them to get a better understanding of how data are being manipulated to foster belief in race and in racial inferiority. And as I mentioned before, technology is very frequently not colorblind, as we assume it is. There's a book named Genetic Suspects. I wrote a piece in about DNA sweeps. These are sweeps where people are openly looking for Black and Hispanic men to test and put in a criminal database where they become a presumptive assumption of guilt. So if you look at the CODIS database, a federal database now, it's filled with data from Black and Hispanic men who are innocent, but their data is going to be used when they're looking for criminals. White men are essentially excluded from it. And finally, the last book I wrote is about medical consent and how it's being insidiously taken away from us. In this country, a law was passed in 1996 that stipulated several situations in which people can be used for medical research without asking their consent. In fact, without even telling them they're in medical research. And we're all familiar with one case. Don't have a slide for that, sorry. We're all familiar with one of the cases. That was Elijah Mccain. He was killed in Colorado when police officers urged EMTs to give him ketamine. Ketamine experiments are being conducted in Colorado, Minnesota, and elsewhere. And essentially, it's being tested on people when EMTs decide they might be too agitated to calm them down. But ketamine is a very potent drug. And when you give it to people, 40% chance they're going to end up in a ventilator. And some have more serious complications. Elijah Mccain had serious complications and he ended up dying. So this erosion, this taking away of medical consent is a very serious problem. I documented it very heavily in African American communities, but that does not mean it's relegated to African Americans. It's a problem for all Americans. I think we're more the canary in the coal mines. And my fear is that we're going to wake up one day and find out that we no longer have the right to say yes or no to medical research. And I think that will happen unless we recognize it and take legal action to try to stop some of these abuses. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm looking forward to our Q&A.
Thank you so much. We have a ton of attendees leaving feedback in the chat. So I will go over to our first question, which is from Nikki Lee. And the question reads, I have a question about scientific racism, including current research tying anatomical differences, like calcaneus bone size in the foot with race. There are different characteristics in humans based on the 0.1% DNA differences between humans. Please comment on this.
I'll be honest and say I'm not sure. You've said that very well. I'm not sure what more I can add. You know, the differences in DNA certainly exist. The question is, are they significant? Very often people point to the fact that variation in DNA is something that's much more common between individuals within a group, racial group, than outside it. So that if you're talking about determinative differences, we shouldn't be talking about race, we should be talking about what happens within racial groups. But other than that, I'm not sure what else I can address.
Okay, thank you so much. Our next question reads, are there any organizations today working on installing commemorative plaques for enslaved and or indigenous people who were known to have been abused or killed for medical purposes in the U.S.?
There have been. University of Cincinnati finally managed to have a plaque installed commemorating the victims of the radiation experiment that I talked about. Unfortunately, when the plaque was installed, it was installed in an area where very few people go, behind a dumpster, remote part of the campus. That's part of the problem with commemorative plaques. Unless one can stipulate they're going to be in a high visibility area and what the content of the plaque is, then they not necessarily useful. There's a lot of debate in New York City around the wording of a putative plaque that was going to replace the James Marion Sims statue. And the wording that I saw, I was very unhappy with. It wasn't accurate, and it downplayed the abuses and the situation. It really offered more of an exculpatory, dialogue for Dr. Sims and an accurate rendering of the abuses. So although they are being erected, I think that communities should decide it for themselves. But personally, I'm not sure commemorative plaques are the best way to go if you want to honor the victims. I mean, I know it works sometimes and it may be a case-by-case basis, but I think that unless the people issuing the plaque have a lot of control over the content and the placement, it may not actually achieve what they want to achieve. I also want to interject that the thing about statues and plaques, people will often say that if you want to remove a statue like Dr. Sims' statue, oh, you're trying to change history. No, you're trying to correct history. And moreover, statues and plaques are not historical documents. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we're trying to do too much with them. I mean, they are a very good article, I believe, in Atlantic pointed out, detailed how many of the Confederate statues, for example, were actually not historical markers, but testaments to racial biopower. They were erected at times when African Americans made important civil rights achievements. Voting right acts, for example. That's when the statues went up as a reminder to people who really holds the power in the area. So I think there's a lot more thinking that needs to be done around commemorative statues and plaques.
Thank you so much for that response. And then the very last question also came in our chat as well. Please, could you share the books that you recommended on the previous slide again?
I don't know if they mean my previous slide.
on all, just a book list or reference list, because all of them have been phenomenal. And so the whole group is just saying, we want to read those books.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'd be happy to. I'll send you a list and then you can distribute it to people who are interested.
Absolutely. And then we do have a couple more minutes. I'm not sure if anyone else has a question, but please feel free to insert it into the chat or using the Q&A feature on Zoom.